a big welcome to all of you that have decided to join us for the next half an hour. As we're going through the webinar, if you have comments or if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat window, and I'll try to address the questions by the end of the webinar, if not during. And there will be moments when I ask you all to share, let's say, words or thoughts, and that's where I'd like you to use the chat window as well. So without further ado, because this is a poetry webinar, we're going to start with a poem. And I'm going to read a poem by somebody named Billy Collins. It's called Introduction to Poetry. So this is how it goes. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. This is from Billy Collins' Introduction to Poetry. And this brings me to the most fundamental question, I think, that's relevant for this webinar, which is, what is poetry? What does it mean to you? So either now or during the course of the webinar, I want you to respond to this question in the chat window. What is poetry to you? Take about a minute to think about it. And then if you think you have a response, type it in the chat window. If you don't, just sit with the question and perhaps a response will come to you during the course of the webinar. So I'm just typing the question in the chat window. What is poetry? What does poetry mean to you? Take a minute. Think about it. If you think you know, do share your response with us in the chat window. If you're not sure, that's also okay. Okay, so Vanita says it's ethos, pain, and reflection. Vritika says poetry is coming back home, knowing about who really I am. Yeah, that's very true. Tanupreet says poetry is me. It is my way to express myself. Nice. So keep thinking about it. If your definition changes, if you want to add to what you've said, feel free to put that in the chat window over the course of the webinar. There's one definition of what poetry is that really sticks with me. And this is something that an individual by the name of James Wright with a W, said. He said, poetry is the crucial relationship between craft and imagination. And I think that really sums up what, at this point in my life, poetry is to me. It's meant different things at different times. But right now, this idea of it being both a skill as well as this very intuitive, vulnerable, imaginative space, this marriage of these two things, that's what it is for me right now. And that's sort of the definition that I'm going to be going with for the duration of the webinar. My name is Pragya Bhagat. I am a writer. I feel really weird saying I'm a poet, but I'm also a poet. I've been writing poems since I was a little girl, as perhaps some of you also did when you were little. But I started performing and publishing a few years ago. So I don't have all the answers, but I'm also trying to figure out what poetry means to me, just as you all We're trying to figure that out. Now, the title of this webinar, I want to spend some time on that. The title of this webinar is a bit misleading. I'm not going to teach you how to write a poem. You'll have to do the writing entirely on your own. What I am going to do is I'm going to talk to you about how to build a poem. So if you were to think about a poem as a house, right? And its stanzas are sort of the rooms. In fact, the word stanza comes from the Italian word, which means little room. So if you were to think about the poem as a house and all of these different elements in poetry as rooms in this house, then you can also think about how if the structure of the poem is strong, the house is going to stand and last. But if the structure of it is weak or lacking somewhere, the whole house can collapse. So today we're going to talk about what are these different elements or components of a poem. Each of these components are important in their own way, but I'm going to spend some time talking about 5 different elements, and of course there's more. Some of these elements I also address in the poetry workshops that I take with Bound. For example, next week I'm going to start a beginner's poetry workshop, so I talk about some of these elements then. And some of these elements might be things that you're familiar with, some of them might be new to you. But at the end of the day, I also think poetry is a lot of fun. I think it should be play. And this is something that your English teacher might disagree with me on, because I remember in school, at least for me, poetry was all about analysis and finding meaning. And as I read in the Billy Collins piece, trying to like beat out meaning from the poem. But at the end of the day, poetry is something that should be enjoyed. And I only read poems that I enjoy, and I only write the kind of poems that I would enjoy. So in this funny way, these different elements in poetry, these different rooms, create a sense of play and wonder between ideas and words. And we're going to glimpse that for a moment over the next few minutes. So the 5 elements that I'm going to talk about are, the first one is image. The second one is figurative language. If you want to be taking notes, you can. You don't have to. The third one is sound. So things like repetition, rhythm, rhyme. The fourth element is form or structure. And the fifth element, which I'm going to be spending the most time on, is the line. The line. So I'll start with image. There's a gentleman by the name of Robert Haas, and he says a good image makes something so real. It's like being alive twice. And I thought that was such a beautiful way of expressing what poetry can do, the way that the images that we create as writers have the power to really linger with us. It's not because the things that poems say have not been said before. These are things that have been said for centuries and eons, but it's the way that you say it and the images that you create that have power. So a good image in poetry can force the reader to pay attention. And if the reader stays in the poem, then as a writer, you've won, like you've done it. That's success. So image is the first element that you can use to build a poem. The second element is figurative language. You might have heard of terms like metaphor and simile before, you might have not, but these are examples of figurative language. So a simile and a metaphor are when you compare one idea to another idea. For example, if I were to say love is a rose, that is a metaphor because I'm saying love is a rose. But if I were to say love is like a rose, that is a simile because I'm using the word like or as a bridge, as a connecting force. The magic behind figurative language is that the more unlike the two ideas that you're comparing are, the more power the poem holds. So for example, if I were to say, love is a rose, that's something that you would have heard in some form or fashion, whether it was in Shakespeare, whether it was in a Karan Johar movie, whether it was a pickup line, or in a Mills and Boon's book. But it's a pretty cliched idea, and love and rose are not very unlike, they're very similar. So it's not as powerful of an image. But if I were to say love is a dog from hell, which is a metaphor that Charles Bukowski uses, that is a much more powerful use of figurative language, because I don't usually think of love as a dog from hell. Also, it makes me think about, all right, how is love a dog from hell? Perhaps it's generous, but also violent, takes me to dark spaces, has a lot to give. I could go on and on and on. But the point I'm trying to make is that the more unlike these two ideas are, the more powerful the figurative language, the more powerful the poem. So image is the first element in this house of a poem. Figurative language is the second. And the third is sound, things like rhythm and rhyme. I say rhythm and rhyme because they're connected, but they're not the same. And a few of you mentioned in the beginning that rhyme is sometimes seen as basic, or rhyme is sometimes seen as not true or real poetry. I completely disagree with that, but I see where you're coming from, because often we associate rhyme with an echo of a vowel that comes at the end of a line. So I had a cat, she wore a hat, he ate a rat. The words at the end of the line rhyme. But rhyme can also occur within the line. Rhyme can also occur with consonants. It doesn't just have to occur with vowels. There's so many different ways that rhyme can be explored through poetry. Rhythm as well. If you listen to Eminem, or if you listen to any sort of hip hop music, even just songs like Taylor Swift songs, they do this beautiful thing where the reason they can like strum with the guitar or they can play the drums is because the words have a lot of rhythm. And poetry can also follow a very similar rhythm. I say also, but hip hop and songwriting is also poetry. So it's sort of like an umbrella term. So rhyme rhythm is the third element in building this house of a poem. The fourth element is form. When I say form, I'm talking about physical structure. So I think one of you mentioned, I think Payal mentioned it, shaped poetry, sort of when it's on a piece of paper, and if the poem is talking about a wave, but the words are shaped in the form of a wave. Haiku is a formal structure with a limited number of syllables in each line. A sonnet is an example of a poem with 14 lines. So there's a restriction to the form. Prose poetry is also a type of form where it looks like, paragraphs. It's got full stops, it's got proper grammar, but it is also poetry. And then of course there's free verse, which says the form can be anything and everything. One interesting tidbit about form I want to share here. So a ballad is a type of poem that is typically associated with oral storytelling traditions. A ballad has a very strict rhythm of 4 beats, 3 beats, 4 beats, 3 beats. And while there are a lot of, popular ballads that have been written in this conventional sort of classic poetry form, you'd be surprised to know that nursery rhymes are also written in ballad form. So if you were to think about the nursery rhyme, Old MacDonald, it follows the same structure of 4 beats, 3 beats, 4 beats, 3 beats, because ballads are very easy to remember since they have such a strong form and such a strong structure. So for example, if I were to attempt to sing Old MacDonald's, the rhythm would go something like, Old MacDonald's had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm, he had a pig, E-I-E-I-O. So you can see the 4-3-4-3 rhythm. Similarly with Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, her lamb was sure to go. So ballads are things that we have been saying, we've been using ever since we were kids, which I think is amazing. And poetry that way is very accessible to people. It doesn't have to be something only present in libraries or literary circles. The last room in this house, which I want us to engage in an exercise with, is the line. And this to me is such an important part of how to build a poem, because essentially a poem starts with a line, and then there's another line, and then there's another line. And often we think of a poetry as something difficult or inaccessible because we don't see it as lines, we just see it as a unit, and the unit can be like, oh my God, like it has so much meaning. I don't know if I can create something this magical. So there's different ways of looking at what a line can be for you. It can be the length of a breath, however many words fit in a breath. It could be a certain number of stresses or beats. So for example, in Old MacDonald's Had a Farm, Old MacDonald had a farm is one line because it has 4 beats. It could be a physical length, a certain number of words. It could also be whatever ends in a rhyme. That could also be a line. I want to share another poem with you all. And this is a poem by Robert Creeley. And the reason I want to share this poem is because it really demonstrates what a line can do, the power of a line, and how it can be used in a very skillful way. So first I'm going to read the poem, and I just want you to listen. And I'm going to read it without the line breaks, okay? And then I'm going to show you the poem and read it with the line breaks. And I want you to tell me what the difference is between these two readings. Once without the line breaks, and the second time with the line breaks. So this poem is called The Language. Locate I love you somewhere in teeth and eyes. Bite it, but take care not to hurt. You want so much, so little. Words say everything. I love you again. Then what is emptiness for? To fill, fill. I heard words and words full of holes aching. Speech is a mouth. So this was me reading the poem without the line breaks. Now I'm going to show you the poem and read it with the line breaks. And you can read it with me. The language. Locate I love you somewhere in teeth and eyes. Bite it, but take care not to hurt. You want so much, so little. Words say everything. I love you again. Then what is emptiness for? To fill, fill. I heard words and words full of holes, aching. Speech is a mouth. So the first time I read it without the line breaks, just as sentences, and the second time I read it with line breaks, what was the difference? What was the difference in, and here I want to hear from you. So don't type in the chat window. You can maybe just unmute yourself and share. What was the difference in what you felt or what you heard between these two readings? So let's hear from Shama and then Vanita and Ritika. Go ahead, Shama.
Without the line breaks, I think it had a better flow.
Mm-hmm.
It made sense. It seemed coherent.
Yeah.
Actually, it sounded like poetry.
Yeah.
And with line breaks, it just sounded like you were just reading words without any connection.
Yeah. Great point. Go ahead. Next, but Vanita, had you raised your hand?
Yeah, I think it just comprehension was better.
without the line breaks, right, in the first reading? Or are you saying the comprehension was better the second time?
For me, comprehension was better the second time. Also, I think at a personal level, I read more prose than poetry. So for me, I appreciate better when I see poetry rather than hear. I don't know if it makes sense, but
Yeah.
to me, I visually read better poetry. So yeah, it made sense for me the second time. I don't know if that's the right answer, but
There's no right answer. Go ahead, Ritika.
Yeah, so I agree with what Vanita is saying. It's more beautiful when it's with the line breaks.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were reading it, just like reading it for the first time, the line breaks were not there. It
Yeah.
was in comprehension kind of thing for me. When I
Yeah.
was reading it out, it was not meaning anything for me. But when you
Right.
slowly with the, you were taking time to read each of the words, it meant something to me. I was able to, understand it better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interestingly, this poem is an attempt for the speaker to express that he loves something or someone, but he's not quite able to say it. So the line breaks, in fact, are meant to give this like indication of like, I don't know what I'm saying, like I'm just using words and it sounds random. And it wasn't meant to make sense, right? Like if I'm trying to say I love you to someone, but I don't want to say I love you, I'll use these random words. And so that was, I think, the impact that Robert Creeley was able to create through this poem called The Language, using line breaks, which I think makes all the difference between, let's say, comprehension versus what doesn't sound comprehensible, and even in terms of the power of the words. And it also allows you to sit with the words. It's almost like this person is thinking and they themselves don't know what they're thinking, and that is communicated through this piece. So I wanted to share this with you to demonstrate the power of what line breaks can do. Now what we're going to do, the 5 minutes that we have left, is we're going to start building our own poem. And I say start building because building is a process, just like writing is a process. And it might continue beyond this workshop. It might be something that you stop when we say goodbye to each other. So unfortunately, we have to bid farewell to each other. This is a very short webinar. But if you have questions, if you have anything you want to talk to me about, I've shared the link of the workshop. I'm also going to share my Instagram handle. It's just Bhagat Pragya. So feel free to DM me on that. And any questions you have about the workshop, about poetry, about words, about poets, I'd be happy to answer those. And with that, thank you all for spending the last half an hour with me. I'm really grateful that so many of you are interested in poetry. And I think from what I've read, you guys are doing fine. You guys are doing great. You just have to continue doing it. So have a great evening, everyone. And
Thanks, Pragya.
hope to hear from some of you soon and see some of you in the workshop as well.